Recorded in the New Testament are 37 miracles that Jesus performed. 36 of them were beneficial in some way. A hungry multitude was provided loaves and fish to keep from fainting on the way home after hearing Jesus teach for 3 days. The sick were healed of various diseases, plenty of miracles regarding that. 3 times the dead had their lives restored to them. One of those was Lazarus, and Jesus himself stated the reason for the raising of Lazarus from the dead in John chapter 11, verses 43 through 45. In those verses we read, "Now when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come forth.' And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, 'Loose him and let him go.' And then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen the things Jesus did believed in him." And so we find that the purpose for the miracle was to cause people to believe. Just before he did that, however, Jesus thanked the Father that he had heard him concerning what he was about to do. "And I know that you always hear me," Jesus said to the Father, "but because the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." So he said ahead of time why he was doing the miracle, and the miracle is recorded as having precisely that effect, that people believed in what he had done. Jesus wrought 36 constructive miracles. But this morning we want to discuss the other one, the most unusual miracle that we read about in Matthew 21:18 through 22. First, we want to note that the time of the year was a few days before the Passover. The Passover took place in the first month of the Jewish calendar, days 14 through 21 of that week. And these are specified in Exodus 12, 17, and 18. Now, this month corresponds to our late March or early April. And Jerusalem, where this miracle occurred, is on the same parallel roughly as Tifton, Georgia, which is about 50 miles north of Valdosta. The climate on April 1st in Jerusalem varies between a high of 57 and 76 degrees. And so that was what the climate was like, that was what the place was like, and it was a little early to expect figs, but the fruit developed before the leaves. Therefore, if a tree had leaves on it, it should also be bearing fruit, but no fruit was there. So Jesus cursed the tree. Now, this is so unusual, we have to ask, why does this event occur? There is a second aspect to consider about this time and about this day. Mark and Luke tend to be chronological, but Matthew often goes by association. So here is the actual chronology of the things that were occurring during this last week on earth of the Lord's life. The chronology is simply this. Sunday, Jesus entered Jerusalem in great triumph. He went to the temple looked around, and then departed. On Monday, he cursed the tree on the way into the city to cast out the money changers and the sellers of animals. But Matthew does not record this as being in the morning. He just speaks of it after that has already occurred so that he can finish telling what happened. So this actually occurred on 2 different days. He curses it on Monday, and they see it on Tuesday, but Matthew just brings both aspects of this together so he can finish the story. Tuesday then, on the way into the city, the disciples notice the tree has withered. And Mark's chronology is found in Mark 11:12 through 14, and also verses 20 through 26. But now, why? Why did Jesus do this? And I think most of us will probably see a connection between the fig tree and a hypocrite. The tree boasted of fruit that it did not have. It professed to be something it was not. Since it produced such luxuriant leaves, it should have borne fruit also. The same is true of many of the Pharisees. They called attention to their righteous acts, but frequently they were not righteous. They even called attention to their righteousness to God. If you remember, Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, remember that the Pharisee there prayed with himself, and he told God how good he was. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Who's he trying to convince about his righteousness? God already knows the things that we do, and he also knows the motivation for us doing them. Their righteous acts then gave a false impression because what they often did was only to be seen by men. And so many will feign humility and sincerity when actually that is not their true character. Christians can do the same thing today. If we're not careful, we can give substantially to the Lord, be present for classes and worship opportunities, and yet this could basically be for show. If Christianity is for show and not for the love of God, what good is it? And what good was it for the Pharisees? Jesus expresses his contempt for only making a show without really bearing fruit. Paul said that a Christian could possess spiritual gifts and do many mighty works of faith. But if he did it without love, it was worthless. 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 through 3. Not only can Christians be like many of the Pharisees were, so can congregations. Jesus even rebuked Ephesus, which at one time was one of the most faithful, one of the best congregations in the world, but they had degenerated. So let's take a look at Revelation chapter 2 and verse 4. Jesus says, after naming several of their good qualities, and they did still have many good qualities, he says, nevertheless, I have this against you, that you have left your first love. Was some of what they were doing now for show? Were they continuing to do certain things, but their heart was not in it? We don't know precisely what was what. We know they were still doing really good things, but they had left their first love. neither as a Christian nor as a congregation do we ever want to lose our love of God, our love for the truth, or our love for one another. Our worship and our service must be genuine. So I believe that Jesus is making a point here about bearing fruit and not just being there for show. And thus he cursed the fig tree. But could Jesus also be thinking of something else? Could the tree symbolically represent the nation of Israel? Such a notion is not without precedent. Jesus has already told a parable with a fig tree standing for the nation. Let's take a look at Luke chapter 13, verses 6 through 9. In Luke 13:6 we read, "He also spoke this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. Then he told the keeper of the vineyard, 'Look, for 3 years I have been coming seeking fruit on this fig tree and found none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground?' And he answered and said to him, 'Sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around and fertilize it. And if it bears fruit, well, but if not, you can cut it down.'" That fig tree pretty much represents the nation of Israel. And in fact, the nation of Israel was at the point of withering and dying. Notice what Jesus will say shortly after the passage we're studying today in Matthew chapter 23, verses 37 and 38. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate." Yes, and in about 40 years, the temple would be destroyed. The house of God would be destroyed. Jerusalem would be destroyed. They were on their way out. Israel had once stood out from all the nations, and unfortunately, now she was simply bearing leaves without fruit. They boasted that they were the children of Abraham, the special heritage of Jehovah, sole possessors of the knowledge of God. But in reality, they were empty and barren. They still had ceremonies. Some scrupulously tithed. They talked a whole lot about righteousness and being God's people, but they had no true devotion, no true righteousness, no worship from the heart. Outwardly, they may have been better than some other nations, but these other nations never claimed to be gods. They never claimed to be holy. Israel did, but they were not. Notice other teachings of Jesus that confirm this notion about the nation. Going back to Matthew 21, let's begin with verse 28. "But what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and said, 'Son, go to work today in my vineyard.' And he answered and said, 'I will not.' But afterward he regretted it and went. Then he came to the second son likewise, and he answered him and said, I go, sir. But he did not go. Which of the two did the will of his father? And they said unto him, the first. Jesus said to them, assuredly I say to you that the tax collectors and harlots enter the kingdom before you. Now what that represented was the first son represented the Gentiles, and the second son represented Israel. God wanted the Gentiles to obey him, but they refused. But later on, they became of a penitent nature. Israel said that they would serve God, but in the end, they did not. And so Israel is not the son that is praised here, but the one who ultimately did his father's will. There is more. Let's continue reading with verse 33. Here another parable. There was a certain landowner who planted a vineyard and set a hedge round it, dug a winepress in it, built a tower, and he leased it to the vine dressers and went to a far country. Now when the vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the vine dressers that they might receive its fruit. And the vine dressers took his servants, beat one, killed another, stoned another. And again he sent out other servants, more than the first, and they did likewise to them. Then last of all he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But when the vine dressers saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize the inheritance. So they took him and cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to the vine dressers? Well, anybody knows the answer to that, don't they? This again represents Israel. This represents the city of Jerusalem. And it shows how poor they were at this time in trying to obey God. First of all, in rejecting him after saying they would serve him. And second of all, even going to the point of killing the son. This shows you the real state of the heart of the nation. When they reject Jesus, the Son of God, a man who went about doing good, performing miracles, offering evidence, even raising Lazarus from the dead, as we showed earlier. And they did not and were not convinced as to his character. There's something gravely wrong in the nation, and they would be punished for it. Now let's make a couple of observations about all of this. One of the commentaries that people often look at is from Barclay, and he does oftentimes have some interesting insights, but he is a liberal, and that is shown by what he said concerning this event. He said, first we see Jesus blasting a fig tree for not doing what it was not able to do. The tree could not have borne fruit the second week of April, and yet we see Jesus destroying it for not doing that very thing. Second, we see Jesus using his, and I put the word sick in here, that's the way he wrote it. He doesn't capitalize the pronoun with reference to Jesus. Second, we see Jesus using his miraculous powers for his own ends. That is precisely what the temptations in the wilderness he determined never to do. Well, anybody who takes it upon himself to criticize Jesus certainly doesn't lack for arrogance. Imagine somebody writing these insulting remarks concerning Jesus just because he didn't understand the point of what Jesus was trying to get across. Jesus was talking about hypocrisy, whether personal or national. And the fig tree was a symbol of that, and it showed his displeasure toward it. All the other miracles of Jesus were beneficial, 36 out of 37. This one, the cursing of the fig tree, stands as an object lesson. It's an object lesson for us to learn some important truths about God. It does show us that Jesus had absolute control over nature. He still possessed great power. Nothing had changed. He had been demonstrating power all throughout his ministry. And this miracle here is no different, except it's one of a destructive nature rather than constructive. Now, the thinking person would necessarily draw the conclusion that Jesus being put to death in Jerusalem was by his permission, since he could have used his power to prevent it. As we sometimes sing, he could have called 10,000 angels. He had the power to prevent being crucified, but he allowed it to occur. And it also answers the question in advance that is asked in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 40. Taking a quick look, that question was asked while Jesus was on the cross, Matthew 27 and verse 40. They were saying, "You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Jesus answers that question. Well, he couldn't save himself, but he could. He had the power. The thing he could not do was save himself and save us. One or the other had to occur. He could have saved himself, had the power to save himself, but he remained on the cross in order to save us. Had he come down from the cross, he wouldn't have been the sacrifice, and we would not have salvation. So he permitted his crucifixion. Christians must be careful not to be barren as the fig tree was. In fact, we should act by faith. This was the latter part of the passage, verses 21 and 22. Jesus was trying to teach that his disciples should act in faith. Now, we do not have the power to do miracles as they did, but we can do many things for the cause of Christ if we take it upon ourselves to do so and to act in faith. Without faith, we become worshipers going through the motions, saying the right things, perhaps even teaching the right things, but not being the right person. The apostles needed to live and pray with confidence, and so do we. This thought is repeated in James chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. James writes, "But let him ask in faith. Let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." Thus, we are expected to act in faith. We need to ask ourselves some very tough but important questions. Am I genuine or hypocritical? Am I a person of faith or just for show? In what can we be dependable? One person said, be so dependable that if you say you will be somewhere and don't show up, they send flowers to your family because they know something drastic has happened to you. Jesus Christ, the ultimate dependable example. He did not quit at the last minute. He did not live all of his life and then at the prospect of being on the cross just say, I quit. He did not come down from the cross, no matter how tempting it might have been to do so. Can the one who has been dependable for us depend on us? Are we standing for Christ? Are we living by faith in how we respond? If we have not submitted to the will of God, then it is time to do so. It is time to repent of sins, confess that he is the Christ, the Son of God, and be buried with him in baptism, where his blood will wash away all sins, and we will arise to walk in newness of life. Those are things that we must do in order to be saved. But then we must stay faithful. We must stay dependable. Does this describe you? Or if these things do not describe you, what changes do you need to make today? If you've never obeyed the gospel, it's time to obey. If you have done that but not remained faithful unto Christ, not lived by faith, it's time to change that also. Can we help you in any of these things? Let us know this morning while we stand and while we sing.